Hello and welcome to the next episode of The Professor and CEO. Today we're going to be talking about resilience, and it's been great for me just thinking in the last week or so about this topic and what resilience really means, and how we as a business and I as a leader have had to become more resilient in the crisis that we've all been going through. Just introducing myself again, Ben Gillam, CEO of ThirdWay. And what really sort of drove me to want to do this series with Rachel was bringing the academic world and the business world together and talking through this crisis and the key themes and things businesses are going through, and how by sharing these ideas and discussing them, we can help business leaders and others to really focus on the crisis, the challenges at hand, and getting through them. So that's a brief intro to me, from me, and over to Rachel.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Doern and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship, and my research tends to relate to entrepreneurship in times of crisis with a focus on crisis management and resilience. And today, as you know, we're talking about organizational resilience. And if I could just point everyone to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And if you have any questions in relation to the topics we'll be covering today, to please put them there and we will come back to them a little bit later and address them. So again, we are talking about organizational resilience, which is quite a big topic and one that we should probably return to, but also one that we have covered in part in the past. In other episodes, for instance, we discussed detecting vulnerabilities and preparing for a crisis. So that's more about the proactive side of resilience. We also talked about flexibility and improvisation, and within such pivoting. So that's about being reactive in part to a crisis. And then in episode 3, we further discussed the resilience of individuals, so individual entrepreneurs and employees, also in relation to well-being and leadership styles. And leadership styles are also incredibly important from an organizational resilience perspective. So today we're just going to focus on a few topics in relation to organizational resilience. But before we do, I also want to just say a few words about resilience and organizational resilience more especially. So resilience has really been described a lot previously as the ability to bounce back from adversity. And this comes from the Latin root of the word resilience in large parts, and organizations are often labeled as resilient if they're able to rebound from a crisis promptly, and if they're able to return to some kind of initial or normal state. However, this view of resilience is also based on our understanding of crises as one-off events, as being short-lived, and often as with crises that are that have clear beginnings and clear endings, which more generally poses problems, but also more especially recently with the COVID-19 pandemic as things are evolving. So it calls into question the notion of what is normal exactly, and what kind of normal state might we return to, and is there only one kind of normal? And by doing so, we also discount all of the learning, all of the adaptation, all of the innovation that goes on in reacting to such crises. And another way to think about organizational resilience is as the ability to maintain a stable equilibrium throughout adversity, throughout a crisis, and as a way of absorbing the shocks in relation to a crisis. So this might occur by actively attending to some of the risks apparent in the current environment. This might occur in relation to thinking about how can organizations mobilize, how can they strengthen their ability to respond to those kinds of risks in a proactive fashion. It's also about thinking about how different parts of the organization come together to react to those events. And finally, we can also think about resilience in relation to vulnerability. So resilience has these positive connotations. It's associated with positive adaptation and things like being active in terms of one's problem solving, being flexible, mobilizing and strengthening resources. Whereas vulnerability, in contrast, tends to have a negative connotation. It tends to be more associated with negative adaptation and being more passive in one's approach. It's also associated with insecurity and inevitability, and these things in turn are not necessarily helpful for mobilizing resources and strengthening the organization during times of crisis. So just a few words about that. So what kinds of factors do contribute to organizational resilience? So there are a number of factors and topics that we'll discuss today. So for instance, the resilience of an organization does depend in part on the structure of that organization, and creating a more flexible, organic structure is really important, and something that CEOs and managers and entrepreneurs should be thinking about doing during this particular period of crisis as well. So organizational structures can really facilitate resilience on the one hand, or they can serve to create barriers to resilience on the other. So researchers have suggested that more mechanistic, bureaucratic, top-down organizational structures dependent on layers, like tall hierarchies and layers of management, where the people at the top make all the decisions and the people at the bottom don't, that these structures aren't conducive to being flexible, to being reactive in times of crisis, and really that these kind of organizational structures as well were more well suited to times of when the environment was stable, when people focused on the domestic market, when information and expertise was limited, and maybe only a few people within organizations possessed those kinds of skills or expertise or even education. So in environments like the current crisis, where there's less stability, where there's more uncertainty, where change is a feature, organic organizational structures are really needed. To those kinds of structures that enhance connectedness, those kinds of structures that are based on, that are team-based, that are network-based, that serve to create cooperation and collaboration and a more decentralized approach to decision-making. This is what people should be thinking about now in terms of creating structures that facilitate resilience. So Ben, turning to you, would you say that
No, we definitely had. As you were talking there, I was scribbling loads of things down and started to question how much we have or whether we should have done more. I think we as an organisation have an advantage in that we founded the business in the last recession, so we were sort of born out of a crisis, and so naturally at that period of time you sort of think you develop resolve. And there's loads of case studies of good resilience and poor resilience from competitors and other just companies in industry. So I think what we had was a really good base case, that we always believed in keeping good cash reserves in the business. And I've always sort of taken the view, you've got to have 3 months of cash to identify a problem, 6 months of cash to rectify a problem, and an additional 3 months of cash of grace. So we've always had that year's sort of like view of like cash is there to sort of help the resilience of the business, that you need to react. And I think we had a good baseline of culture, that we knew we had people who were committed to the cause and would come with us, and great client relationships. But what we had to quickly do was have a real openness to change, which was we had to change even the management structure and the leadership structure in the organization. We had certain individuals who had good resolve for this type of crisis and the right way of dealing with things and communicating with people, and others who weren't. So we quickly adjusted and adapted and changed that and made that clear. So the leadership teams knew who to go to for what. We worked incredibly hard on clarity of communication, really making messages simple for the other leaders within the business, like saying, look, here's the 3 key metrics that we need you to focus on and deliver, and that will make this company resilient, and this will give us what we need. But also really touching on your point there was, within that, it gave them the confidence to make change, because we could be so clear about what we needed and what we didn't need. Actually, that created the perfect pocket for them to have the autonomy to act and the autonomy to drive change within their teams and their departments and on their P&Ls to deliver performance. So what we've actually seen in this period of time is, because of that, and I think it stems out of the cultural piece and also the cash flow piece, that we've had to put people under huge pressure, we've been able to communicate well, we've been able to communicate clearly, and really leave people room to make effective change within the organization. And that's sort of been a really sort of like powerful resilience tool for us during this crisis.
Great, thank you. And you sort of touched on some of the things I wanted to mention in relation to my next point, which is that entrepreneurs and organizations should really be trying to mobilize resources from their team over this period, and to ensure at the same time that they have adequate resources over the crisis. So employees, the characteristics they possess, the way they interact, all of these things are potential sources of resilience. So in the former case, certain characteristics possessed by team members, like self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is about our ability as individuals to feel confident and competent to carry out certain tasks, as you alluded to feel a sense of mastery and such. Also emotional stability, openness to experience, resourcefulness, self-discipline. These are all characteristics that are really important and can help to enhance resilience during a crisis. And it's also the case that relationships between employees themselves can also be critical in relation to resilience, can help to support learning, can help to create a kind of open environment, and an environment in which problems can be solved and the company can move forward. So I think in times of crisis, companies really need to think about how to continually create those linkages between individuals, between teams, between departments, to help increase efficiency and flexibility and innovation within the organization, which maybe now, because of the pandemic, becomes more challenging, but at the same time, through IT support and other kinds of synchronous and asynchronous activities, is also possible but different. So Ben, you sort of alluded to this already, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that. Are there certain characteristics? Over the last few months?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key ones is the openness to change and the acceptance of the need of collaboration. And believe it or not, that actually hasn't come out of success. That came out of failure, out of a mistake we actually made, which was, and it goes back to your earlier topic about decisions being made at the top of an organization without some suitable consideration and conversation lower down the organization. So when the furlough scheme came in, it was like, okay, look, this is a scheme that we need to utilize to actually sort of help the business like manage its resource, manage its cash, and look after its clients during this time. But whilst we were sort of dissecting what the furlough scheme meant and also thinking about sort of long-term financial strategy, what we didn't do well enough was actually speak to the delivery teams and collaborate effectively on how much resource they actually needed. And what was the risk to the organization if we pulled that resource back too far? And actually what we found in the early phases of the lockdown, when we utilized furlough, was actually we went too far. We probably furloughed too many staff who were there to perform the delivery function. And we quickly realized that this would become a false economy because we would start to let our clients down, we wouldn't deliver our projects as well, our margins would slip, and actually in the long run that can be really challenging. So it's actually something I'm really proud of in the organization, that although the actions up front were good, we were quick enough to realize the need for change, to collaborate, to actually consider the learnings and then make better decisions for the future. So I think it's that openness to collaboration, that openness to change, so not being dogmatic that you've made a decision and you're going to stick with it no matter what. Because when you're flexing your resilience muscles, it's probably because you're in crisis. So you need to be really sort of adapt to change. And that's what I think we've done particularly well, or certainly a lot of individuals in our organization have.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to stress that during a crisis, especially a crisis like COVID-19, that organizations, and you mentioned this as well, need to ensure that they have adequate resources, right? Especially given concerns around infection rates increasing and cases of self-isolation and quarantining and successive lockdowns on the horizon, etc. It's been suggested that organizations need to have clear plans in place to cover potential absences as well. So not even people on furlough, but also it seems very likely that people in the past have had to step away from work for different reasons, and that people in the future might need to do so as well. So the organization really needs to, all organizations need to really be creating kind of succession planning, an internal form of succession planning for different individuals, especially those in key leadership roles, especially those in other critical roles. It might be IT rather, for your sector. It could be other things for different sectors. So almost like a kind of living will, if you will, for the organization. So Ben, with that in mind, how have you ensured?
So I think what I've come to realize with resilience is, if you've got good resilience, you quickly turn crisis management into what feels like business as usual. And if you think of business as usual always has these same problems, like the technical problems of, do we have enough resource? Do we have cover for holiday? What happens if our staff take all their holiday at the same time? Like, are we going to fail to deliver projects? So what we've been able to do is really focus upon what we can control and what's likely to sort of come at us via government restrictions or via lockdowns and things we can't control. But when they happen, how can we put the right levels of supporting and the right levels of resilience into the business? So it's a strange time because you're looking at the business and thinking the economy is contracting as the business contracting, but at the same time you're actually planning to recruit and bolster certain areas, whether short term, medium term, or long term, to protect them. And so I don't want this answer to sound like waffle, but for me, it's actually the resilience has been the ability of the leadership team to just see that as a business as usual challenge, to look at the key metrics, to look at the importance of delivery, to look at the importance of protecting our people and our culture, looking after our clients, and preserving our cash reserves, like those sort of core resilient traits that we had, and using them sort of alongside our core values to make decisions and plans. That there might be plans that we have to tear up and throw in the bin, or they're plans that we know we can enact immediately. So that's what I would say it's been, loads of scenario planning.
Okay, great. Thank you. And another, I think, important point or issue is that entrepreneurs, CEOs, managers, and organizations really need to also think about how they can enhance organizational resilience by expanding the decision-making boundaries within the organization. So this is really about ensuring that different employees have both the ability and the authority, as well as the resources to make decisions on the spot and across a variety of situations as well. Decisions that might otherwise require lengthy, timely authorizations from other managers, which are likely to frustrate those individuals, but also to frustrate employees and also the clients or customers who might be affected by that as well. So during a crisis, companies should really be designating people who have the necessary and up-to-date information, but also the expertise to make good decisions. And as I alluded to, the resources as well. So that could be financial resources, that could be practical resources. So you as a CEO, other people as entrepreneurs or managers should be thinking about what decisions could be made by somebody else to free up my time, but also at the same time to empower other people on my team. So Ben, have you changed your
We have, but being very self-critical, still not well enough. And it's a journey we're going on, and I'll perhaps try and explain some of that. We're sort of quite a broad organisation in that in the organisation, where we turn over 120 million as a whole, that's done by about 10 different business units, and we have leaders in each of those units who are on different journeys. Some are very well versed in management now, some are in their sort of first venture into management. So we've got people with sort of naturally different experience levels and different skill levels in that area. And my way of traditionally running the business with those leaders was, hey, look, I'll worry about all the tricky stuff and I'll free you up to worry about all the positive stuff, driving the business forward, onboarding new clients, growing the team. And we realized before the crisis, about a year ago, we needed to change that. Actually, we needed to give our leaders more autonomy over their P&Ls, over their decision-making structures, so they could master their business units and actually lead in that decision-making process. And actually we were there to give direction and command, but they were there to manage and have control. So it was a journey we were going on. And then the crisis came, we've had to ask people to do more of that. But what I've come to realize that we haven't done well enough is, it's one thing giving people decision-making responsibility. It's another thing to prepare them for the decisions they're going to have to make, and to coach them about the emotional aspect of making tough decisions, the psychological aspect of all of a sudden have more control of a P&L and more ownership of the decision that gets made. And so whilst we have, in the crisis and before the crisis, become very good at giving people more autonomy and more control, we need to be better at coaching our leaders into what that actually means and the challenges that might present themselves when that comes. Because in a crisis, you have to act quickly. we might be giving our leaders direction, saying we need a decision from you, which is your decision to make, but in a small window, a small time window. And that's not fair. We need to sort of get better at coaching them into that. So the control doesn't feel like a strain. It feels like the strengthening of a muscle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And are you making any progress in that domain? And how would you advise other companies to sort of coach people in relation to the emotional element? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think, we're quite heavy on coaching in our business. We have a number of coaches that we employ who work with the leadership team. That's sort of accessible for everyone. But also I've increasingly come to learn my job as a CEO is to do some of that coaching as well. An external coach might not be able to foresee the problems that the organization are going to face, but they're there to respond when someone needs them. I increasingly have seen that my job with the senior management team is to start coaching them to foresee what that problem might be, to start getting their mind into the place of tough decision making that they might have to do, and be ready for it. So when it comes, it feels like they're in execution mode as opposed to discovery mode.
Okay, thank you. So another point to mention is that organizational resilience can also be enhanced by using resources that teams, that organizations currently have at their disposal, and perhaps repurposing or reconfiguring those resources in different ways. So this is what we like to refer to in management sciences as bricolage. So this could be about using equipment, using space, using people, even using routines and roles in different ways that haven't previously been utilized or imagined even. So the example I'd like to give here actually comes from some of my reading around adventure racing. So which is something that I imagine you do with some of your staff from the pictures that I've seen anyway. But adventure racing is really a team-based endurance sport that gets people over a few hours or a few days or a few weeks to go out into the wilderness and engage in a lot of different kinds of activities, one after another. So it could be abseiling or kayaking, trekking, running, hiking, climbing, etc. So a number of different things. So it's really a very physical sport, which involves a lot of problem solving activities as well. So what the teams tried to do in this case to be more resilient is that they recognize that one's attention in these kinds of environments is a limited resource. So in order to protect such, they tend to pre-assign backup roles for key positions, because not everyone can be on all the time. Not everyone can make good decisions all the time, and people need to sit back and to recharge. So there's always somebody else waiting in the wings to take over, and they can't necessarily predict as well when someone will need someone else to step in. So they're quite flexible in their orientation. So I think that's also a good way to think about how organizations can also reconsider specific roles or even routines in their businesses. And in relation to such, Ben, would you say that you...
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that stood us in good stead is we're a business that is constantly designing solutions for our clients, and it prides itself on looking at what's next, and the drive for flexibility in solution as well. That if you create the perfect solution, it should make itself redundant very quickly because you're enabling people to do something better than they did before. So I think that sort of intent exists within us. And the two key areas for us as an organisation is how we use our own space. And that was at first about make people feel comfortable in the space, because we want people to be here to collaborate. I don't think Zoom will ever be able to match one-on-one team contact when it comes to collaboration. So that was one piece. But now going forward, it's about what we've looked at is we've got certain teams in the organisation who do different but similar roles. Can we actually, by bringing those teams together and having them work in a different way, become more efficient across the whole organisation? And that enables us to deploy our people differently, but also to use our space differently in terms of the space we provide for them to meet, to plan, to strategize, to design for their clients. So they're the two key areas for us. But then also in terms of delivery, we've had to look at all sorts really. If we actually broke it down, I think we'd be surprised at across the organisation when it comes to logistics plans and delivering our product and delivering for our clients, how we've managed procurement packages and safeguarded delivery. We've probably done far more of it than we've realized. And I think it really goes back to one of our earlier sessions, if not our first session, about quickly recognizing what type of organization you are and what you need to be for the market that will be left at the end of the recession. Like for us, we were very comfortable recognizing we were shapeshifters, that we will be doing some of what we did, but we're doing some totally new things as well. And therefore, we had to look at our resources and start to deploy and point them in the right direction. Equally, I think if you were a business that was like, hey, we're going to hibernate, bunker down and be business as usual, what we do will be here when we come back, I think you still do it, but you do it in a very different way. Like it very much then becomes about making sure your team are match fit for when the return comes, making sure that you're really, really focusing on sort of like cutting out some of the inefficiencies within the organization and using the time for that.
Thank you. And also thinking a little bit more about resources. Entrepreneurs and organizations should not only be repurposing and reconfiguring existing resources, but they should always be continually creating, building, acquiring, and retaining resources as well, which include but are not limited to social networks. So in general, and as I've mentioned before, organizations with a greater breadth of resources tend to be those organizations that are more resilient to external disturbances, shocks, etc. And resources are essential to the extent that they serve to buffer against adversity. So they mitigate the risks involved in a crisis and can help to limit the negative outcomes or consequences relating to such. And resources might include things like having access to information and advice and emotional support, practical support, financial support, and also social support, of course, which can lend itself, so social capital can lend itself to acquiring some of these other resources. So social capital is the sum value of our network resources. So it can help us acquire resources, but also it is a resource in and of itself. And during COVID-19, I think a lot of people across industries have been turning to their networks for more information, for advice. In hospitality, I know people have been following certain industry leaders. Industry leaders have mentored other businesses, which was especially important when uncertainty was at an all-time high a few months ago, and when government support and advice and guidance wasn't all that forthcoming at the same time. Also in sort of forging more or perhaps even deeper relations in one's sphere, in one's industry, like hospitality, people have lobbied together or come together and pressured the government for more support at the same time, which possibly evolved into the Eat Out to Help Out scheme here in the UK. And also more recently, different people within certain industries are coming together to take legal action against the government as well. Like in hospitality, the hospitality industry feels it's been unfairly disadvantaged by a lot of the recent rules and regulations around COVID-19 as we go into successive waves of lockdown, like the 10 p.m. curfew, which has directly affected restaurants and pubs and bars. So I think strengthening one's existing bonds, but also developing new bonds, forging new relationships, both in relation to other individuals, but also within one's community, and certainly more professionally as well. These things will help to enhance resilience. So Ben, have you been...
Yeah, absolutely. I think whilst I think the best advice I can give is a piece of advice someone gave me years ago. There's a guy who works for me called Jonathan Sweeney, who was a COO of a business we did a project for, and I managed to poach him from that company to come and join us. And very early on, I remember we went for lunch, and I was like, "Hey, John, give me some advice. Like, where should I be spending my time? Like, in your opinion, as a CEO, how should I split my time?" And he was like, "I would say this: 50% of your time needs to be in the organization, and 50% of your time needs to be outside of the organization, i.e. in industry, looking what's going on." And I've always used that as a really good rule of thumb for how to divide my time week by week, month by month. And so I think it's a particular strength of our organization, and perhaps even in myself as a leader, that I do that. But it's key because, like, you can't be an island in a crisis. You have to see ripples where what ripples are being caused elsewhere. You need to see the pressure points that other organizations that you work with are under, and that's both upstream in your client base and downstream in your supply chain. So unquestionably, I've spent a lot of time speaking to particularly clients, in my case, particularly sort of stakeholders at the front end, because I believe that within our industry, commercial real estate, there's going to be a seismic change in the way we will go about doing our business. It had already begun pre-COVID. I mean, COVID is going to accelerate that. So my job has been to make sure we as an organization are market ready and resilient for what the second half of 2021 will present to us and what I believe the next decade will present to us. So I totally advocate that. And I'd say to sort of any business leader or aspiring business leader listening, you can never know enough people in your industry. You'll never sit there and say, oh, I know too many people, but you might sit there and say, I don't know enough. And so whether you're introverted or extroverted, you have to find the discipline to spend a significant amount of your time speaking throughout your whole supply chain, your whole industry. And that will make you resilient, and it will give you a good radar for where to point the rest of the ship. And never forget, the ship, they're looking for you. So to give the coordinates where to point it. So learning from others is a great way to do that and hone in on where you should be going.
Thanks, Ben. Some really good advice there. And it's also the case that organizational resilience might depend on the interconnectedness of our networks. So we know that resilience is strongly affected by not only the relationships we have with other businesses, but including those businesses, of course, within our supply chain. So problems experienced by one party in a supply chain can very well have knock-on effects in relation to other parties. And previously, we've talked about the importance of entrepreneurs and CEOs and managers being alert to certain vulnerabilities in their supply chain in our session on detecting vulnerabilities and preparing for a crisis, and looking for red flags like being too dependent on one particular client group or one particular supplier, or looking out for slow deliveries, or looking out for invoices that are past their due date. Things like that could actually signal a problem in the supply chain. And if you dig a little bit deeper into research around supply chain disruptions, it doesn't take long to find that people generally, organizations generally, tend to experience at least one supply chain disruption a year in any case. So imagine what it's doing to people, to organizations now in relation to this particular crisis. It must be absolutely ongoing. And I think supply chains have become more interdependent over the years. And there's this real focus on supply chain efficiency and cost effectiveness and so on. And I think in becoming more interdependent, it's also made some organizations more vulnerable to the kinds of disruptions that we're seeing now. So what can organizations really do now to strengthen the resilience of their supply chains? I think they can do a few things. One, they can sort of look into their supply chain and think about, is there anything that we can do ourselves? Is there anything that we can take control over? Also, I think it's important, as I alluded to see where you're relying on single sources in some cases and whether or not you can diversify instead. And another thing is to ensure that there's transparency in your supply chain. So it's not only enough to look at who is supplying you, but who's supplying them, and so on and so forth, because it's these pieces of information that can really help in such situations as we see ourselves in now. And I came across a story of Nike and how it was coping during the early stages of COVID-19, and in particular, in China, when China was first affected, and all of a sudden all of its shops shut. And because Nike sort of had the foresight, because there is transparency in its supply chain, and because it has a digital form where it communicates with its contract manufacturers in China, it was able to divert goods very quickly, which were supposed to go to certain stores that were now closed, to instead going to e-commerce centers. So I think that really helped it to be more resilient and to save a lot of money in that particular circumstance. Also, it's the case, I don't know if you want to comment at all on that, Ben, in terms of your supply chain, or...
It was really interesting for us because we were acutely aware that in this crisis, if cash flow became a problem for our general industry, the supply chain would feel it first. And that for us was a high risk. And it was something technically outside of our control because we don't have obviously full transparency to their accounting situation and what levels of debt they might have. Although we audit as quite stringently, and also we're very careful how we pair supply chain and work. But it was something that to be considered. And I think what it goes back to, this whole session is just really reminding me, is that resilience isn't something you try and develop in a crisis. It's something that just has to run throughout an organization. You should be constantly reviewing your supply chain and thinking about the weaknesses and where it could fall over and the inherent weaknesses of the way that your industry might transact. I think the example you gave is a great example. Show that when you are partnering with the right people, your ability to pivot together actually enhances both the supplier and the provider. It's a really great example and something to learn from.
Great, and I'm aware of the time, so I want to jump to some of the questions. So how can an organization not only survive through a crisis but also thrive as a result of resilience?
Yeah, I think the best answer I can give to that, resilience enables you to quickly change your mindset from survival to thriving. That's the best answer I can give. That anyone who would have gone into this COVID crisis, their immediate concerns would have been, right, what is the impact on our business? Are we going to be able to survive? If so, in what form? But your ability to answer those questions quickly, get a handle on them, foresee the next set of challenges and questions that are going to present themselves, and flip the business mindset into, now we're just in a business as usual mode, you have a great ability and a great opportunity to thrive. So I think it's the lesson I think today is build resilience into your daily, weekly, monthly strategizing for business. And that's the muscle you flex in crisis mode that changes the mindset from survival to thriving and taking advantage of the opportunities that a downturn does present.
And I think that there's another question here that's quite similar, which is, does ThirdWay actually look for strategic opportunities within a crisis? And I think it sort of ties into my final question as well, which is really about kind of prioritizing projects and perhaps prioritizing some of the opportunities that come up. And you mentioned previously, Ben, I believe it was in our session on flexibility and improvisation, when we were talking about pivoting, that sometimes organizations can try to do too much, that especially in a crisis when opportunities do present themselves, that they can try to do too many things at the same time. And at some point you have to commit. So how do you prioritize what are important projects to focus on? And how do you ensure that you're taking advantage of those opportunities in the process?
So I would say is if I took ThirdWay as an example and thinking about that resilience and then strategizing for opportunities that the crisis presents, I think we've got some really good fundamentals in place. Like I said, like cash reserves, culture, client base. And then also we are always looking at the future. We are always talking about what the future looks like, what the challenges of our clients are, and how we can meet those challenges. So if you like, the raw ingredients for strategizing, dealing with crisis and exploiting opportunities there within the business. I think where we could be better is actually scenario planning and sort of on a quarterly basis saying, okay, what are the most likely crisis we're going to face? What happens when that happens? Are we robust enough to deal with them and look forward to thriving? I think the key thing to say is downturns do create opportunities, and I believe they've created some fantastic opportunities for our business, and it feels perverse to say something like that. But I think we all as business owners and even like consumers of news on business have got a little bit carried away with like the Facebooks of this world and the unicorns that seem to sort of pop up out of nowhere and get valued at sort of billions of pounds overnight. Business is about incremental gains on a quarterly basis over a sustained period of time. That's how you grow. That's how you become sustainable. That's how you build a culture. That's how you build a client base, how you build a reputation, and how you really generate shareholder value. And what we've really focused on in the crisis is, yes, we put a lot of energy into creating new product lines for the market we believe we're coming out of, but we don't expect that in a 6-month or 12-month window that those product lines are going to change the market or fundamentally change the business. We believe what they will do is lead us into this period of change, but it's a 3-year, 4-year journey to establish them, create great market traction and market share. So I guess what I'm trying to say to those listening there is don't think you're going to come up with a wonder strategy that's going to completely change the game. It could happen. It's probably going to be more luck than anything else if you do. Have a strategy that's like right for the business, that's right for the future of the business and for the market you're going into. And then strategize on a regular basis about that and improve it, improve the team behind it. And that's the way to deal with it and to approach it.
Thank you. And perhaps just to finish, a final comment and question. I think as we all are moving through, certainly in the UK, through this successive kind of lockdown period, and many of us feel that not only have our wings been clipped, but also we're feeling more squeezed. We're feeling the pressures on us from an economic perspective, but as well from a social perspective. And that's interesting. And if I reflect back to our third episode, we were talking more about individual resilience, all these things that we kind of hold as protective factors to help us weather through difficult times, like our social connections, being with friends, being with family members. These things are becoming more difficult now. And I think it's about finding other ways in which to maintain those connections. So it is a very difficult time. And I guess I want to finish by asking you, Ben.
Yeah, I think if I had to pick one thing, I would say the team. We've managed to build a really good, committed, talented leadership team within the organisation, and it's been a team that's been able to adapt to the crisis and focus upon the challenge at hand and things that really matter. And I guess the long answer behind that short answer is that doesn't just happen overnight. That happens by building a culture. It comes from building trust. It comes from clarity of communication and being as transparent as you can. And that, is both the short and the long answer as to what's been good for us, but I think also would stand a test for any organisation.
Okay, I think that's a great place to finish, and that we have covered a lot of ground today, and then we're just at the same time sort of scratching the surface. And there's so many other directions that we can go in and will do in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, and take care, and goodbye from me.